coming up here. So, anyway, first of all, Mr. Berleman, Madam Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here tonight. Thank you for coming. Tom mentioned 3 times turbulent area. When we think turbulence, we think the Middle East. Now, one of the big things that's out there in the world today is the fact that unlike most of the period since 1989, we have major global challenges to our way of life, our value system, and the international order that America and friends put together after World War II. That's very worrisome. The primary threat comes from Russia and China in different ways. A more undefined threat comes from the Middle East as a whole, and I'll cover that tonight. The interesting thing is, no matter how bad the threat from the Middle East is, and it's not a happy time in the Middle East, it's not as big an existential threat to us as China might be, as Russia could be. But yet, if you look at the newspapers, this is all you hear about. You hear about the Iranian deal, you hear about Turkey bombing simultaneously all kinds of people. Look, I spent 9 years in Turkey and I'm having a hard time keeping track of this. You hear about what we're doing with Egypt. The Saudis are angry at us, etc. And it's been that way for a long, long time. And it raises the question of just what's going on in this region. And tonight, what I want to do is, and this was Tom's initiative, take a step back and talk a bit about some of the cultural, religious, and historic, the help of my notes, historic background that has led to this region being so different. Let me start with the roots. To understand the Middle East, and by the Middle East I define it as that region from Morocco sweeping across the Sahara Desert in North Africa, jumping across the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant, Turkey, all the way to Afghanistan and Pakistan. 2 things characterize it: Islam and a homogeneous geographic and to some degree demographic and cultural identity. Until you get to Iran and Afghanistan, you're dealing with Semites, Arabs, Jews, Berber, south of Turkey. And in that whole area, you're dealing with a very similar geographic landscape. Steppe land, desert, other than fertile areas along the Mediterranean. Herding, long-distance trade, a tough environment, a very strong tribal system of atomized little communities clustering around little towns, little villages, some bigger towns. And that's been the Middle East for millennia. This region is different than other areas where Islam has taken root. In the Balkans, in Indonesia, in the Philippines, Bangladesh, Malaysia. It is a different environment in physical terms, it's a different environment in geographic and historical terms. Therefore, we don't have much of a problem in terms of foreign policy, generation of terror, and that kind of thing from the majority Muslim states in the Balkans, from Indonesia, from southern Philippines. There are movements, of course, but it's nothing to worry all that much about. The Middle East is very different because it's this combination of Islam and a culture that very much propels some of the ideas that are very strong in Islam. Muslims talk about people of the book. Those are the 3 religions that follow one after the other, beginning with Judaism. An offshoot of Judaism is Christianity, and to some degree an offshoot of both is Islam. Muhammad and the people around him were well aware of the Bible. They were monotheists, that is, they believed in one God, and that was something new in the Arabian Peninsula, so they adopted that. But they're a hybrid of the Christian and the Judaic traditions, and I have to be a bit critical of all three here. Islam is a millennial religion like Christianity. Its belief is that its views, its values, its theology, its God will someday rule the world and through proselytation convert everybody to that religion. That's its mission. That's its calling. Judaism doesn't believe in that. Judaism is the religion of one tribe. But there's another difference, and that is Judaism is a fascinating and rich religion that has cultural rules on everything from what you eat to what you wear, when you wear it, how you deal with other people. It is basically an entire social, political, economic code of existence. Christianity got rid of all of that. Can anybody tell me why, from a geopolitical standpoint, not a theological standpoint, Jesus, the disciples, and the church fathers decided they didn't want to identify their religion with all of the social, political, dietary, and other accoutrements of Judaism? Any ideas out there? Okay. Yeah,
like a religion for the masses.
Exactly. Christianity wanted to become the religion of the entire known world, which was largely the Roman Empire and Persia. And that was a very pluralistic, heterogeneous world with all kinds of different areas, different cultures, and all of that. So Christianity focused on universal values that would travel over the Roman Empire. Aside from meekness, because it was a religion of the downtrodden, it focused on theology and morality, because that travels. It didn't talk about which meats you could eat, which meats you couldn't eat, which part of your bodies would get snipped and which wouldn't, which obviously would not make it a popular religion in much of the Roman Empire. And so it had a tremendous ability to expand by pitching itself. Its business model was, we're all about theology, the afterlife, and morality, how you deal with your fellow man. We're not about conquering things. Now, Christianity and the cross has done as much conquering as anybody else. And it's made reference to, let's think of the Crusades, Christianity as the justification for it, but it cannot find that justification in the books. Islam is a bit different. It started off as the religion of a warrior class. Muhammad was part of a rich trading family that was part of the elite, and in that era, elites were all warriors. And he started, in essence, a military revolt that seized Medina and eventually conquered Mecca, and then spread like wildfire around much of the known world within 100 years. It certainly spread among all those areas where people had a similar culture, similar landscape, similar economic modalities. Therefore, it was able to do two things. First of all, to promulgate and find acceptance of a tribal, desert, small community culture. And so in its world, it was able to spread not just theological and moral ideas, which weren't all that different from Christianity, other than issues of the God-man of Jesus, but also a whole set of values of how to dress, of how to treat women that resembled the Old Testament, that resembled the code of Judaism in its original form. And thus it is a missionary religion, like Christianity, but it is a religion that has all sorts of accoutrements that Christianity doesn't have, and explicitly sees the spread of this religion not by persuading poor people sitting around at night outside of taverns, but rather by conquering cities, because that's how it spread. And that has shaped how it looks at the world. And if you're a devout Muslim, you have to deal with that. And they deal with it in all kinds of ways. And the Quran and the Hadith and the writings allow you to do all kinds of things, including, while you cannot make peace with the non-believers, you can have a ceasefire. And a ceasefire can last hundreds and hundreds of years. It did with the Byzantine Empire. So there are ways to mitigate some of the writings, but you have to follow the steps one after the other, and you cannot deviate one way or the other, or you will be charged with being an apostate, which is not a good thing to be charged with. Second, its relations with the outside world. My thesis is, by and large, the other, the non-Muslim for the Islamic world, is the Christian West. It encountered, obviously, all sorts of non-Christian groups in its initial time of conquest. But basically, what stopped it in the first 100 years in most places was geography. The Hindu Kush and the Himalayas, the jungles and the diseases that come with jungles below the Sahara in the subcontinent of India, with one exception. It was militarily stopped by Christian forces. The Byzantine Empire. It dealt the Byzantine Empire a tremendous blow in the early years. Not stole, nobody steals anything from anybody in history, but conquered Egypt and the Levant. Those were Byzantine provinces. But it could not seize the Byzantine central citadel of Anatolia, today's Turkey, for most of it, Greece, and the Balkans. It made it to Spain, but when it tried to push north, who did it encounter? The Franks, the nascent French state, which stopped it in the Battle of Tours in 732. So right from the get-go, it found an enemy, and not an enemy all the way up on the borders of today's China, or down way to the south of Senegal, but an enemy a few hundred miles to the north in Constantinople, which it tried to conquer 2 or 3 times by sea. And it was aware of this, and there was a back and forth for 1,500 years between the Islamic world, which emphasizes the unity under the Caliph, first the Umayyad, then the Abbasid dynasties in Spain, remained with the Umayyads, but by and large, a unified government spanning all of Islam. More in theory than in practice at any time, but that's the theory, and it is anchored in the Quran. And so it has to be at least an official dream of everybody, just like every Jew says next year in Jerusalem, everybody in Islam should, as a good Muslim, believe that there should be one unified ummah or community of believers under a caliph. So you have that system that more or less survived until 1923. And then it collapsed with the final battle of modernity, which was World War I, where the Ottoman Empire was decisively beaten. But this was after 200 years of losing out, first to Austria in the late 17th century, late 18th century, then ever more to Russia, north of the Black Sea, then to colonial powers, Britain and France, which supported Greek independence after Napoleon landed in Egypt. Then the French came into North Africa, first Algeria, then Tunisia, 1882, then eventually Morocco. The Italians, 1911, Libya. So by the beginning of World War I, the Ottoman Empire had shrunk to Anatolia, little bits and pieces of the Balkans, the Levant, and the Arabian Peninsula, those parts that it could control. And most of that was lost to the Ottoman Empire by the end of World War I. The caliphate was ended by a Muslim, an Ottoman general, Mustafa Kemal, then named Ataturk, and he formed the state of Turkey. So the whole idea was gone. And then the whole region entered this period of trying to emulate the West through the model that Mustafa Kemal Ataturk set up in Turkey, which is kind of a militarized, westernizing state that was very secular, pushed down religion rather like it's pushed down in France, much more so than the secular version of American religion. I mean, look where we are tonight. This idea was that modernity, making the tools, and it gets down to this, making the tools to effectively wage war, is a Western trait, and they wanted to catch up with the West. They wanted to be able to fend off the West, rise up in terms of the colonial areas, and that included all of North Africa, Iraq, to some degree Iran, the states along the Gulf, and the Arabian Peninsula, most of the region other than Turkey and the Saudis. The House of Saud, which by that time, the mid-1920s, had captured Mecca and Medina. So the rest of the region was all under European control, direct or indirect. And so as these states became independent, particularly after World War II, from Afghanistan to Pakistan to Iran under the Shah, it sounds like a royal family, but the last Shah's father was a Cossack cavalryman. These were militarized states: Syria, Iraq under the Ba'athists, Libya under Colonel Gaddafi, the Egyptians under a whole series of generals, and we now have another one, Algeria under the colonels, that were very pro-Western in terms of technology and mindset, particularly as to the role of religion, but very anti-colonialist in what we call in the diplomatic world, third worldish in their views, very neutral, not very happy about the United States, not willing to support us, or at least not until recently. So that was the experience until about 30 years ago. Then increasingly, be it in wars with Israel, internal conflicts, these state models weren't working either. And you had rising up, both in Iran, with the advent of the Islamic State, but also among the Sunni communities, supported by the House of Saud, which had made a pact with the Wahhabi religious leadership of the Arabian Peninsula, which is a very extreme, I would say, extreme form of Sunni Islam, to promulgate that religion around the Islamic world in return for legitimizing the House of Saud's rule over the great holy cities, Mecca and Medina. And these developments, slowly but surely, uprooted the very limited efforts that the region had made towards the modern nation-state system with a more or less modern Western veneer about it. Now this veneer is all over the world to another degree. Even Russia and China, although they reject certainly American leadership and they reject bits and pieces of the international system, certainly democracy and individual freedom, and to some degree the American running of the international system, particularly in the security area, but they do accept much else of the system. The Middle East does not. It doesn't from its religious frame of mind, and it doesn't from its historic frame of mind. Back in 2002, the UNDP, which is the development program of the UN, did a survey using Arab scholars and scientists and technicians of the state of Arab society. Now, of course, that was a year after 9/11, but this study had begun. It was well underway before 9/11. It wasn't a response to 9/11. And what it found was really frightening. In fact, because it's a UN organ, because the UN is very politically correct, since then, further UNDP reports on the Arab world, follow-up reports, have been much more politically correct and much more glass half full. This one was devastating. It took a look at percent of people who were literate, particularly women, the role of women in society as a mark of a Western modern worldview, degree of the use of technology, be it computers or other forms of technology, patents, copyrights, the number of books translated into Arabic throughout the world, and then compared it to other areas that were not well developed, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, South America. And the Arab world came up very, very low, despite the fact that this was an area that had been right at the cusp of, right at the forefront of education and reading 1,500 years ago. This was an area awash in oil, and thus wasn't faced with the economic problems, at least at a gross level, that South America or Sub-Saharan Africa had. Yet it was doing very badly. But then, in the last decade, we've had wave after wave of ever worsening violence. And it's clear that the various approaches from George Bush's, which was to try to jumpstart democracy by moving into countries and sort of doing, with the help of the U.S. Army, what happened in Eastern Europe in 1989, that really hasn't worked, or hasn't worked very well. Barack Obama, when he wasn't pivoting to Asia, has tried to make friends with our various enemies and essentially be a bit apologetic about America's past. That hasn't worked very well either. And the region is in the worst shape anybody has seen it in our lifetimes. So what went wrong? Again, the international system is a system dating from 1648 of nation states. The Westphalian system, they call it, from the treaty that ended the 30 Years' War, and ended in Europe the millennial idea of a unified kingdom, religious as much as secular, of the Christians. And that all ended in 1648, and Europe oriented itself around nation states and national groups. That moment never occurred in the Middle East. As a result, and also, you have a different demographic situation. In Europe, with little exceptions here and there, and one big exception, Switzerland, along the borders, each state is its own nation, its own national group. Okay, Austria and Germany are both Germanic. Actually, Switzerland is Germanic, primarily too, with large French and Italian minorities. Belgium is a multi-ethnic state, but most of them are, you know, Sweden is the land of the Swedes, Norway is the land of the Norwegians. Ukraine, a bit complicated, but still the land of the Ukrainians. In the Middle East, you only have 3 states that meet this criteria. Anybody want to give a guess at which those 3 states are? Israel. Israel is one, and you've had your 2 answers. Okay. Okay, Israel, another one. I'll get to Egypt. It's a good answer, but it's not a correct answer. There's a difference. Okay. Pardon? No. No. One nation, one people. Israel meets that criteria. Who also meets that criteria? Pardon? Armenia. It's not in the Middle East, but it does meet that criteria. No. Turkey, Iran. That's it. The rest are all Arab or quasi-Arab, down to Sudan and deep into the Sahara, or a mix of nationalities in Afghanistan and Pakistan, of which the Pashto are perhaps the strongest component, but along with the Baluch and Punjabis and others. So you have no state that can rely and sink deep roots based upon a given language, a given population that identifies with that state as the homeland of that people. Most of the borders are artificial. 2 collapsing empires, the Ottoman Empire in the west, and all the way up to Iran, Persia, and east of Persia, the Raj of Britain collapsing in the east, produced these states artificially with their borders from 1918 to 1925. Now, I don't want to attack their borders. All borders everywhere in the world are artificial. They're based upon wars and diplomacy and people spilling ink on the map and then saying, just drawing a line from the top to the bottom and splitting it there. And they always put groups of people on one side or the other when they want to be on the other side. But that's the nature of everything everywhere. Certainly the Balkans, where Madam Ambassador and I, where she is from, and I spend a lot of time. And it's certainly, Strasbourg is one of the great cities of German culture. It just happens to be in France these days. And that's the way of the world. But in the Middle East, this is very, very dangerous. And it means that the normal SOPs, the normal way of doing business for the United States to deal with an unruly world doesn't work there. Since World War II, and right after World War II, our approach, be it Germany and Japan, but then later, much of the rest of Europe, bits and pieces of the Third World, Central America in the 1980s, the Balkans in the 1990s, Southeast Asia, from the Korean War through Vietnam and so forth, or East Asia. Our approach has been to offer the states of a given region security from a local or global aggressor, their independence and sovereignty, not any kind of special quasi-colonial status with us. We wanted these countries to do well. We wanted them to grow. We wanted them to be successful. We weren't the British Empire. We weren't the Roman Empire. And identification, more or less, with our value system. Rule of law, human rights, democracy, Republican limited government systems, free trade. Within a system, basically, continuation of the Wilsonian 14 points in the League of Nations manifested in the UN Charter, a global system of governance with collective security, peaceful resolution of disputes, again, international trade, sovereignty of individual states. That sovereignty cannot be challenged. It is, but it can't be legally. And that's a pretty good deal. And that's worked in most places where we've been able to deploy it. Russia and China are big question marks, but in the rest of the world, this is more or less worked out. In the Middle East, it never has. In the 1980s, we were involved in multiple wars in Central America. Nicaragua, we're trying to overthrow the quasi-communist government with the Contras, protecting El Salvador, which was under attack from insurgents supported by Nicaragua and indirectly Cuba. Obviously problems with Cuba. Panama, we actually invaded the place, Honduras, Guatemala. And then, eventually, everything passed. And though that area still has a lot of problems, more or less moved into the orbit of modern states. Same thing with the Balkans. We fought 2 wars, 1995 in Bosnia and 1999 in Kosovo, and various other quasi-military moves. But in the end, that region is, would you agree, Madam Ambassador, moving in the right direction. And we're not back there. We have 1 battalion in Kosovo of U.S. troops in the entire area. Of all of our troops, Army troops deployed overseas, we have in the Middle East 3 brigades in Afghanistan, a brigade in Kuwait, a brigade in Iraq, the better part of a brigade in Jordan, and a battalion in the Sinai. It's about 2/3 of our troops deployed overseas, other than Japan, Okinawa, and Hawaii, which we count as homeland. It's a lot of troops deployed. And remember, that's way down from 2009 or 10, when we had almost 200,000 in Afghanistan and Iraq alone. So, despite these commitments, despite what we've done, despite our value system, and constantly fighting and usually winning wars or conflicts or engagements, we keep on revisiting the problem. This is very tiring to the American people. Their support for this is way down. It's upped up a little bit in the fight against ISIS, A, because Americans are horrified by its association with Al-Qaeda and the beheadings, and B, because President Obama has, to some degree wisely, to some degree not, but certainly from the standpoint of public opinion, it wasn't a bad move, promised that he won't have any casualties, he won't put any boots on the ground, et cetera, et cetera. The result is we're getting a pretty weak campaign against ISIS, but we're maintaining popular support, and that may be, and that's what you have presidents for, that may be a good calculus. It may not be, but we'll see. But certainly, caution in the Middle East is not a rash position for an American president in 2015, given what's happened since 2001, and given our experience since we first got engaged miserably in 1979 with the seizure of the American embassy in Tehran. We've had experiences in the Middle East before, going back to Eisenhower and Beirut, but obviously things started getting really exciting beginning in 1979 and they never stopped. I do have to stop because I want to give time for questions, but I will say that this idea of the culture behind this is very, very important. Here's an example of how it plays. There's a debate between the administration and its critics whether we should call these movements, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Iranian version of it promulgated by the Ayatollahs in Qum in southern Iran, and some other groups that associate extreme forms of religion with terror, Hezbollah, Hamas, Muslim Brothers to some degree, whether we should call this Islamic extremism or violent extremism. The Obama administration believes that we should call it violent extremism because there's 1.4 billion Muslims in the world, 99.99% of them are not terrorists, aren't supporting in any significant or serious way terror. So why make them all mad? Because most of them are deeply religious and proud of their religion by basically dismissing everybody as terrorists by calling it Islamic terror. That's a very valid point. On the other hand, it's also important to realize that religion plays a role. It's not that the average Muslim is going to see that al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS, is right, but it's that they're not sure he's wrong. And they're uncomfortable about this because he cites essentially scripture, and he does it pretty effectively, and he does it with a fair amount of accuracy, as did Zakawi before him, the Al-Qaeda leader in Iraq, as did Osama bin Laden, as do the Iranian Ayatollahs. And this is a concern for the people of the region. It's another factor that weighs on their ability to function as a nation state. And our tools for dealing with a region involve supporting the nation states and supporting universal values against aggressors. When an aggressor can claim religious inspiration or carrying out a religious plan, it's very hard to mobilize a nation-state system against that when the nation-state system itself is weak. That's the problem we have in the Middle East. That's the problem I want you to take away, because what you'll hear in this rush of information will be, for example, on the fight against ISIS, it'll be speeches by the President or the Secretary of State of Defense saying, we have to get our allies to do more, we have to get the states of the region to stand up. They can't stand up. They're weak states. I've lived in them. I'm the guy that's been sent out to tell them to come up with some troops who can actually fight, drop up some bombs on somebody, do something for God's sake. And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But they're not France. And that means if you want a situation to get steadily worse, step aside and let these countries in the region deal with it, because they can't deal with it. And they won't deal with it, and they aren't dealing with it. On that happy note, that's the background to the Middle East.
We'll take questions now, Ambassador. I have a microphone. It's necessary that you be on the mic. So, De Sulis in the back here.
Hi, thank you for coming.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could share maybe 2 or 3 examples of how the impasse between Shia and Sunni sects has influenced diplomatic policy at your station in your life.
Sure. I'll give you a couple of examples, but I'll also give you an example of how this all comes together. There is a split between the two major sects of Islam, just as there is a split once. There was initially a split between, a very subtle split that got worse after 1054, between Orthodox Christianity and Western Catholic Christianity, and then there was a split of Western Catholic Christianity into two major subdivisions, the Protestant Church and the Catholic Church. The complication is both the Sunnis and the Shia believe in one ummah, a community, ruled by one leader. So it raises the question, how can you do this if you've got two separate sects? And the answer is, you convert the other one. People aren't forever Sunnis or Shia. Egypt was a Fatimid Shia state in the 13th century. At that time, Iran was primarily Sunni. It didn't become majority Shia until the 16th or 17th century, the Safavid Turks coming in. I mean, this is just very complicated stuff. But everybody I talk to in the Middle East knows this stuff 100 times better than me, and they know the possibilities. They don't want to become Shia if they're Sunnis. If they're Shia, they don't want to become Sunnis, because they figure they'll be second-class Sunnis. So they want the Shia to win. And this has been held in modernity with the nation-state system such as it was in the Middle East. This was held in check. With the nation-state system seemingly melting down, it leads to problems like Yemen, like Lebanon, like Bahrain, where you have mixed populations. And these mixed populations soon become influenced by the outside powers, typically Turkey and Saudi Arabia on the Sunni side, helped at times by the Emirates, by Jordan, by Qatar, or Qatar is very quirky, and Iran will support Shia or quasi-Shia, or people who didn't really know they were Shia, like the Alawites of Syria, but because they're not Sunnis, they now are supported by the Iranians. I'm trying to figure out how to couch one of certainly the most dramatic moments that I've had in the Middle East, but it indicates both the unity of Islam and the problem of Islam. I was talking with a Shia cleric who was running in 2005 in those elections that some of you old enough may remember, the Purple Finger elections, where most of the Iraqi population, to its credit, and it was legitimate, went out and voted at great risk, because the Al-Qaeda movement under a guy named Zarqawi, who at times had been supported by the Iranians, had fought with a Kurdish group. I mean, the Middle East is a very eclectic place. But he was leading the Al-Qaeda movement, and his main shtick was, don't waste your time killing Americans, kill Shia. Kill them in their mosques, killing them in their marketplaces, kill them in their nurseries, get them when they're young. I mean, he was just awful. And he is the forefather of the entire ISIS movement today. And the ISIL movement, or ISIS, president calls it ISIL. Nobody else calls it ISIL. Everybody even calls it Daesh. Nobody knows why the president calls it ISIL, but he keeps doing it. So therefore, everybody in the government is going to keep saying ISIL, but they slip up all the time and say Daesh or ISIS, but they're not supposed to. Anyway, so I was talking with this Shia cleric who was risking his life, just being a Shia was risking his life, but he was running for office, which meant he had to go out and campaign like in America. And that was really risking his life from a suicide bomber or a sniper. He was a really cool guy, spoke English, and was smoking a cigarette. He was wearing a black turban, which indicates in Shia Islam that he is a descendant of the Prophet. And I thought that this is a guy who could explain why Zarqawi, the Sunni Islamic leader, had issued a fatwa saying that democracy and voting was un-Islamic, so anybody who does it is haram, or basically violating Islamic codes, and thus is an apostate and can be killed, etc., etc. So this is pretty dramatic, and this guy clearly doesn't believe that because he's running for office. So I said, what do you think about what Zarqawi said about democracy not being compatible with Islam. And I knew that as a cleric who clearly believed in democracy and clearly hated Zakawi, he would have a good answer, and I would be enlightened. The guy thought a bit, looked up, threw on his cigaretto, looked at me, smiled, and said, you know, Zakawi has a point. This is the Middle East. It is very, very difficult for Western values to be infused into that system. Even for the people who believe in them, they make an exception from their belief system, their religious beliefs, and as a practical matter, embrace things that are good for their society, good for them. But they, if pressed, are going to have all kinds of interesting answers. Okay, more questions?
Another question?
Please, Madam Ambassador.
Probably I have to mention for the group that I had a chance to work with Ambassador Jeffrey in Albania. Actually, in those years specifically when you were asking countries like Albania to support a cause which was right, and Albania is one of the probably the most pro-American countries in the world, and still is.
Mm-hmm.
In light of all the explanation that you just said, as Albanian citizen, I always had a question. Why Albania from this part of the world is always called an Islam country? We as Albanians don't quite understand that. You know the country, you know how,
You notice how I handle that tonight. I said, even in the Balkans, those countries of majority Muslim are different than the Middle East. I avoid calling Albania an Islamic country because it's not an Islamic country, not officially. B, it has 4 religious minorities. None of them are really a plurality. Sunni Muslims, Bektashi Muslims, Orthodox Christians, and Catholic Christians. And religion is of secondary importance. And that works in Albania, just like it works in Bosnia, just like it works most of the time in Indonesia, because it's not part of the Middle East. That's what geography and culture infuse with religion to produce the phenomenon we have with Middle Eastern Islam.
Yeah, I would like to, if you allow me, to probably just make an addition to that. Albania is not actually, as in Bosnia in many senses, because we never had, the tolerance and the relation between people of different religion. I have understood that more as years to come. It's something which is unique in that country. We never had one day of history of those religions fighting to each other, having problems. And in many years, at least I remember after 1990s, when issues were out there, sometimes for other reasons, between Albanian citizens, there were religion people coming, I mean people who were running the religion groups, they were coming all together to show people, the population that this is how you all should come together and fight against different issues. And it is specific, and sometimes I feel people have to know that.
That's absolutely right. Unlike Bosnia, where the 3 religious groups, even though they all had the same nationality, were fighting each other to the tune of 150,000 killed. I mean, far greater on a percentage basis than anything that's happened in Iraq or Syria. It never happened in Albania. Good news story? Basically, yeah, except the asterisk is that's because everybody else in the Balkans was always attacking the Albanians and they were fighting for their existence against everybody else, so they had to stay united as they possibly could. Okay, next question.
Another question? 2 answers and a question.
So, just thinking about U.S. involvement in the Middle East, I've heard different opinions from various people. Some people are more let's get out of the Middle East because we can't fix it anyways, and let's not encourage them to hate the Westerners because we're all involved in everything. And then I hear the other side's no, we need to be there to stabilize, and we have energy dependence and then terrorism that we need to defeat. And so it seems like there's these 2 different poles. Would you side on one of those? Should we be more involved and really try to bring order to the area, or should we just get our hands off it so they don't hate us as a backlash from our involvement?
Yeah, what I'm trying to point out is, to the extent they and we'll leave they to be defined. To the extent some people in the region hate us, they have 1,600 years of history and the tenets of their religion to rely on. If we could erase Israel or erase the American invasion of Iraq or liberation of Iraq, depending on how you look at that politically, it wouldn't matter. They would find a reason to be angry at you and me and other Muslims. Okay, they're good at this, as are people in other races and religions around the world. This is not something unique to the Middle East. It's just, it's harder to fix it in the Middle East for these reasons I've said. We have to become involved. In fact, you hit 3 of President Obama's 4 rationales, and he really believes in this. He said it at the UN in 2013, and he keeps saying it whenever he's justifying any intervention. Remember, this is the guy who wants to pivot to Asia. Preventing terror expanding, preventing weapons of mass destruction, i.e. nuclear weapons, supporting our allies and friends, and ensuring the free flow of hydrocarbons, because without these hydrocarbons from the Middle East, the world economy grinds to a halt. That's the bitter reality. And we have key allies. We have a NATO ally, Turkey. We have a country with tremendous importance to Americans, Israel. We have Saudi Arabia, which is our oil bait for global oil policy. And believe me, global oil policy is very, very important. There's a reason Putin is getting half the price for his oil today that he was getting 2 years ago. And it's not just market forces, okay? I'll leave it at that. So you can't walk away from the Middle East. What you can't do, though, and what we've learned is you cannot send hundreds of thousands of American kids in there to reform the place and make it look like Norway. I spent 3 years on the ground in Iraq watching that happen, or watching that not happen, okay? So don't do that. Keep your forces and your involvement limited. Keep it smart. My problem with President Obama isn't that he has a limited commitment, but I would tweak it 20 degrees to make it a more robust, limited commitment. The problem is, often, as you all know in life, little tweaks make a big difference. And this was a big difference, okay? Other questions?
Another question?
Okay, we got 3.
We got a couple.
You have 3?
Randy, and then we'll go back.
Just curious, Mr. Ambassador, your take on the Iran nuclear deal.
I knew that was coming.
The biggest question about it is, I'll get a little polemical here, but that's okay, because I've come down both sides of this. The biggest question about it is not in the terms of it, but rather, does Barack Obama see this as a transformational agreement or a transactional one? Most of the time, I won't even say most, half the time he, and all the time, Joe Biden talk about a transactional agreement. In fact, they cite the nuclear agreements we had with the Soviet Union. We knew that the Soviet Union was the evil empire, but we thought that it would be a good thing for that evil empire and us to change our mix of weapons and their alert status and other things so we wouldn't inadvertently blow up the world, or we could continue to get ready to conquer the other. Mutual advantage even among enemies. That's transactional. That's what he tries often to sell this thing, but half the time he talks about a transformational agreement. Transformational agreement, Nixon going to China, or at least we thought that was transformational for 40 years, but less certain now, which is the problem with transformational agreements. Or, to bring it forward, Obama's opening to Cuba. That wasn't a negotiated compromise agreement. We simply said, we're going to stop doing all the bad things that we do to you, and we want to be your friend. On the assumption that when they realize that they can trust us and that we're not a threat to them, they'll stop being bad. Because, and there's a theory behind this, any of you old enough to know the 1960s encountered that theory to one or another extent. The reason there are bad countries, dictatorships, and wars in the world is because America does things wrong. So if we stop doing things wrong and reach out a hand to people, they'll stop being bad. I don't buy this theory. So that's my problem. To the extent this is a transformational agreement, we're in trouble because then the goal of getting the agreement becomes more important than what's in the agreement. What's in the agreement, if it's transformational, is minor, trivial, because they're going to become our friends anyway. Look at Pakistan. Pakistan has lots of nuclear weapons, Do we stay up at night? Does Israel and Saudi Arabia stay up at night with the Pakistani Muslim bomb? Hell no. I mean, we worry about terrorists grabbing them, but apart from or war with India, but by and large, because nobody's worried about Pakistan taking over the Middle East or trying to. We are worried about Iran. So a transformational agreement basically turns Iran into another Pakistan, a status quo country that doesn't want to influence its neighbors. I don't think that's right. But fortunately, I don't have to be right. What I do know is Barack Obama isn't going to be around for very long to carry out a transformational policy with Iran. And whoever comes after him, unless he's awfully lucky and funny and amazing things happen in Iran in the next year, is going to be totally focused on containing Iran's depredations around the region, in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Bahrain, and other places, because they're all over the place, and they're doing bad things, and they do bad things to me and my people. So I'm not too keen on it. The agreement itself is a compromise. Probably it pushes Iran from 2 or 3 months to a nuclear device back to about a year, but only for 10 years. Could we have gotten a better